He thought it was just another ordinary day, but what happened next will leave you speechless. No one expected things to take such a shocking turn. Stay with us until the end to witness a story that will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The Smith family was known throughout the neighborhood for their kindness and open hearts. Their home was a place where love and laughter echoed in every room. With 4 children already under their roof, the house was always filled with noise, joy, and the occasional sibling squabble. But despite the daily chaos, Mr. and Mrs. Smith often felt that something was missing, a quiet longing in their hearts that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the topic of adoption came up. It wasn't the first time they had discussed it, but this time the idea felt more real. Mr. Smith looked around at his children, watching them laugh and joke with each other, and a warm smile spread across his face. "I think we have room for one more," he said, glancing at his wife. Mrs. Smith nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Yes, I think it's time," she agreed. The next week, they contacted a local adoption agency and began the process. After filling out mountains of paperwork, attending interviews, and undergoing home inspections, they were finally approved. The agency informed them of a boy named Daniel, an 8-year-old who had been living in the foster system for 3 years. His story was heartbreaking. He had lost his parents in a car accident, and with no living relatives to care for him, he had been placed in a children's home. The Smiths knew instantly that he was the one. The first meeting with Daniel was a day none of them would ever forget. As they entered the small visiting room at the children's home, they saw him sitting on a chair with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His dark brown eyes watched them carefully, filled with a mixture of hope and caution. Mrs. Smith crouched down to his level, offering him a warm smile. "Hi, Daniel. I'm Mrs. Smith, and this is my family. We've been so excited to meet you." Her voice was soft, but it had the strength of sincerity behind it. Daniel hesitated for a moment, glancing from Mrs. Smith to Mr. Smith, and then at the children who smiled at him with curiosity and warmth. His eyes lingered on the youngest of the children, a girl with curly hair and bright eyes who waved at him. Slowly, he smiled back, a small, shy curve of his lips that instantly melted their hearts. "Hi," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. The process took a few more weeks, but eventually Daniel came home with them. Walking through the front door, he was met with the delicious aroma of home-cooked dinner and the sight of a living room filled with colorful toys, books, and family photos on the walls. It was a world so different from the cold, sterile environment of the children's home. "Welcome home, Daniel," Mr. Smith said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Daniel glanced up at him with wide eyes, still unsure if all of this was real. He nodded, clutching the small bag of belongings he had brought with him. One of the older Smith children, Jake, stepped forward and grinned. "Come on, I'll show you your room," he said, motioning for Daniel to follow him up the stairs. His room was small but cozy, painted in warm colors with a bed neatly made just for him. On the nightstand, there was a small stuffed bear that the youngest Smith child had left for him as a gift. Daniel stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. It felt surreal. He ran his fingers along the edge of the bed, testing its softness, and then sat down. Tears welled up in his eyes, and before he could stop them, a few slipped down his cheeks. For the first time in years, he felt safe. That night, everything felt new. New room, new family, new life, but with newness came fear. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding. His thoughts spiraled. What if they change their minds? What if they send me back? His breath quickened, and the room suddenly felt too big, too quiet. Tears threatened to fall again, but this time he heard a knock at the door. It was Jake, the second oldest child. "Hey, Daniel," Jake said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Can't sleep?" Daniel shook his head, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Jake didn't ask questions. He just sat on the edge of the bed, leaning back on his hands, and looked up at the ceiling, too. "You know," Jake said after a moment, "when I was little, I used to get scared at night, too. I'd think of all the scary stuff that could happen, like monsters and all that." He glanced at Daniel, giving him a knowing look. "But my mom always told me that monsters can't live in a house full of love. And this house, it's packed with love." Daniel listened quietly, his eyes slowly moving from the ceiling to Jake. The warmth of Jake's words settled over him like a blanket. Jake leaned forward and added, "If you want, I can sleep here tonight. Just for tonight. I used to do that with my little sister when she got scared." Daniel nodded quickly, not trusting his voice to hold steady. Jake pulled a blanket from the closet, laid it on the floor next to the bed, and flopped down with a big sigh. "There," he said with a grin. "Now, no monsters can get in." That night, Daniel slept more peacefully than he had in years. Over the next few weeks, life slowly became more familiar. His first family breakfast was loud, messy, and full of laughter. He watched as his new siblings argued over syrup and pancakes, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. He still had doubts, still woke up some nights feeling unsure, but every time he did, one of his new siblings was always there to remind him that he was home. The first time he called Mrs. Smith Mom, it wasn't planned. It slipped out naturally one morning when she handed him his lunch for school. "Thanks, Mom," he said, not even realizing it until the words had already left his mouth. Mrs. Smith paused, her eyes widening in surprise, and then a smile broke across her face. She crouched down, cupping his face with her hands. "You're welcome, sweetheart," she said softly, her eyes filled with warmth. From that moment, something shifted in him. He began to feel like he truly belonged. The walls he had built around his heart started to crack, allowing the love of his new family to pour in. But love wasn't enough to shield him from the world outside the house. School was a different story. On his first day, he walked into the classroom with his head held low. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt the stares from the other students. Most of them were white, and their eyes followed him like he was an intruder. The whispers started almost immediately. "Who's the new kid? Why's he here? Look at his clothes." He tried to block it out, but it was hard to ignore the snickering and side glances. His teacher, Miss Baker, glanced at him with a neutral expression, offering no words of comfort. As the day went on, it only got worse. During recess, a boy named Logan shoved him in the hallway. "Watch where you're going, orphan," Logan sneered, shoving him hard against the wall. Daniel clenched his fists, but he didn't fight back. He had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse. "Don't touch me," Daniel said firmly, his voice shaking slightly. "Oh, what are you gonna do?" Logan taunted. "Run and cry to your fake mom and dad?" His friends laughed. Daniel's face burned with anger and shame, but before he could speak, one of his new brothers, Jake, appeared. "Hey!" Jake barked, his eyes filled with fury. He shoved his way between Daniel and Logan, glaring at the group of boys. "You touch him again, you'll have to deal with me." The boys backed off, mumbling under their breath. Jake placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and leaned in close. "Don't ever let them make you feel small," he said, his voice strong. "You belong here just as much as they do." That moment stayed with Daniel for a long time. It was the first time he realized he didn't have to face the world alone. He had a family, a real one, and they would always have his back. And that was just the beginning. School was supposed to be a place where kids learned, made friends, and grew together. But for Daniel, it quickly became a battlefield. The first few weeks were some of the hardest he had ever faced. At home, he was surrounded by love, laughter, and family support. But at school, it felt like every pair of eyes was on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to mess up. On his very first day in class, his teacher, Miss Baker, introduced him to the room. She barely looked at him, her tone flat and disinterested. "Class, this is Daniel. He's new here. Find a seat." No welcome, no kind words, just a quick wave of her hand toward the back of the room. Daniel walked slowly to an empty desk, feeling the weight of every stare on his back. Whispers followed him. "Who is he? Why does he look like that? Is he poor?" He sat down, gripping the edges of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. As the days passed, the whispers didn't stop. Some kids, like Logan and his group of friends, made it their mission to remind Daniel that he didn't belong. They would accidentally bump into him in the hallways, knock his books to the floor, and laugh as he picked them up. "Oops, didn't see you there, orphan," Logan snickered one morning as he shoved Daniel's shoulder, causing him to drop his lunch tray. The clatter echoed across the cafeteria, and everyone turned to stare. Food splattered across the floor, and for a moment, everything went silent. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His face burned with embarrassment, and for a second he wanted to disappear. He crouched down, reaching for his tray, but before he could pick it up, Logan's foot came down on a sandwich, crushing it flat. "Look at that mess," Logan sneered. "Can't even hold a tray right." His friends erupted in laughter, their voices loud and sharp. Daniel kept his head down, forcing himself to breathe slowly. His hands trembled as he gathered up the ruined food. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to, but he could hear his father's voice in his mind, telling him to stay calm, to be smart, to think before acting. "Need some help?" a familiar voice asked. Daniel looked up and saw Jake standing over him. His older brother didn't even hesitate. He crouched down, picking up pieces of food in the mangled sandwich. Jake's eyes locked onto Logan, cold and sharp like a warning. "Got something to say, Logan?" Jake's voice was low but powerful. Logan opened his mouth but quickly shut it again, looking away. The laughter stopped. Jake didn't have to say much for people to get the message. Daniel wasn't alone. They cleaned up the mess together, and Jake walked with him to another table. "Don't let them get in your head," Jake said as they sat down. "They want you to react. Don't give them what they want." Those words stuck with Daniel. He repeated them in his head every time he walked down the hallway and felt eyes on him. But things didn't get easier. If anything, they got worse. In class, Miss Baker rarely called on him, even when he raised his hand. When he did get called on, she'd sigh as if he were wasting her time. One day, while working on a math problem, Daniel raised his hand for help. Miss Baker glanced at him, her face twisted in irritation. "Figure it out yourself, Daniel," she said loudly, turning to help a student across the room. A few students snickered. He sat there, gripping his pencil so tightly it almost snapped in his hand. The humiliation was a heavy weight on his chest. That afternoon, he told Mrs. Smith about it, while she helped him with his homework. "She doesn't like me," he muttered, erasing the same number over and over. "She doesn't even look at me." Mrs. Smith paused, her eyes softening. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Some people don't see how special you are, Daniel, but you have to know it for yourself. You don't need their approval to be great." Her words felt like a small light in the darkness. He nodded, still feeling that knot of frustration in his chest, but it wasn't as tight as before. The next big incident happened in gym class. They were supposed to be running laps around the track, but it quickly turned into something more. Logan and his friends had found a new way to make Daniel's life miserable. Every time he ran past them, they would accidentally step into his lane, forcing him to swerve or slow down. "Come on, faster, orphan!" Logan shouted, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay focused, but it didn't stop. On the final lap, one of Logan's friends, a bigger kid named Brandon, pretended to trip and fell right into Daniel. The impact knocked Daniel off balance, sending him tumbling to the ground. His knees scraped against the rough track, tearing holes in his pants and leaving bloodstains behind. Laughter exploded around him. "Careful, Daniel," Logan cackled, his grin wide and full of cruelty. Daniel sat there for a moment, his heart pounding in his ears, his fists digging into the gravel. He wanted to get up, run over to them, and fight, but his father's words echoed in his mind again. "Stay calm. Be smart." The gym teacher, Mr. Reynolds, watched from the sidelines but didn't do a thing. He didn't even walk over to check if Daniel was okay. "Get up, Daniel," Mr. Reynolds called out, his voice cold and impatient. "If you're going to fall every time someone bumps you, you'll never get anywhere." The words stung more than the scrapes on his knees. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. Slowly, he stood, brushing dirt and blood from his legs. His classmates stared at him, some with pity, others with amusement. Jake wasn't there this time. He had gym class at a different time, and without his brother, Daniel felt smaller than ever. But he didn't cry, not in front of them. He walked slowly, carefully, back to his place on the track. He finished the last lap alone, his face set with quiet determination. That night, at the dinner table, Mr. Smith noticed the bandages on Daniel's knees. "Rough day, huh?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. Daniel nodded, his appetite gone. He pushed his food around his plate, not saying much. Jake watched him quietly, his jaw tight. "They tripped him on purpose, didn't they?" Jake finally said, his voice sharp with anger. "Yeah," Daniel muttered, eyes focused on his plate. "But it's fine. I didn't give them what they wanted." Jake smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That's my little brother." He raised a hand, and after a moment, Daniel grinned and gave him a high five. Mrs. Smith watched them with a smile, her heart swelling with pride. The days that followed were filled with more of the same, the little jabs, the whispered insults, the deliberate accidents in the hallways. But Daniel didn't crack. His siblings had taught him how to stand tall even when it hurt. A few weeks later, something changed. During lunch, Logan and his friends tried to pull the same trick as before. They bumped into him as he was carrying his tray, trying to make him drop it. But this time, Daniel didn't stumble. He stood firm, gripping the tray tightly. Logan raised an eyebrow, looking surprised. "What's wrong, orphan? Not scared anymore?" Daniel stared at him, his eyes steady and calm. "Not of you," he said, his voice clear and strong. Logan blinked, stunned. The cafeteria got quiet. No one laughed this time. No one said a word. Logan's face twisted with confusion, like he didn't understand how his usual tricks weren't working anymore. Daniel didn't care. He walked to his table, sat down, and ate his lunch with his head held high. That night, as he sat with Jake on the living room couch, Daniel leaned against his brother's shoulder. "I didn't give them what they wanted today," he said softly. Jake glanced down at him, pride shining in his eyes. "Good," Jake replied, pulling him into a side hug. "That's how you win." Daniel smiled, his heart feeling just a little lighter. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was stronger than he realized. Years passed, and the boy who had once been too afraid to sleep alone had grown into a confident, determined young man. Daniel was no longer the quiet, unsure child that had walked into the Smith household all those years ago. He had faced challenges, endured pain, and overcome hardships. But he had never given up. Every insult, every shove in the hallway, and every dismissive glance from his teachers only fueled his resolve to be something greater. And now, he was on the verge of achieving something he had only dreamed of, becoming a doctor. High school graduation was one of the most emotional days for the entire Smith family. The ceremony was held outside on the school's football field. Rows of students dressed in blue caps and gowns sat in neat lines, their families cheering from the bleachers. Daniel sat near the front, his hands resting on his knees, his heart thudding in his chest. He could hear the names being called one by one as his classmates walked across the stage to receive their diplomas. His mind replayed the years that had led up to this moment. Every night he stayed up studying, every time he told himself he couldn't fail, and every moment he leaned on his family for support. When his name was finally called, Daniel Smith, the entire Smith family erupted in cheers. His brothers and sisters waved their arms wildly. Mr. and Mrs. Smith clapped with tears in their eyes, and Jake let out a loud, proud whistle that echoed across the field. Daniel felt his chest swell with pride. He walked up to the stage with his head held high, his heart pounding like a drum. As he shook hands with the principal, he glanced out into the crowd, locking eyes with his family. They were all smiling at him, and in that moment, he felt it. The unshakable love and pride of belonging to a family that had never given up on him. Later that evening, the family threw a graduation party at home. The house was packed with balloons, streamers, and the delicious smell of Mrs. Smith's famous lasagna. Laughter echoed in every room, and the family played music loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a plate of food in front of him, but he barely touched it. His mind was still buzzing with the weight of what came next. "What's on your mind, kid?" Mr. Smith asked, sitting next to him. Daniel glanced at his adoptive father, then back at the plate. "College," Daniel said quietly. "Becoming a doctor. It's a lot." Mr. Smith leaned back, resting his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Yeah, it's a lot," he admitted. "But you've done a lot harder things, haven't you? You survived all those teachers who didn't believe in you. You stood up to those kids who tried to break you. You made it this far, Daniel. I know you can make it the rest of the way." Daniel's eyes stung with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. "Yeah, I guess I have." "More than guessing, son. You know you have," Mr. Smith said firmly. "We're proud of you, every one of us." And they were. The pride of his family carried him forward as he stepped into his next challenge: college. The transition wasn't easy. His first semester was rough. The coursework was intense. The professors didn't hold anyone's hand. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was on his own. But he wasn't. Every week, he had a video call with his family. Jake always teased him about studying too hard, while Mrs. Smith checked on his eating habits. His younger siblings asked him questions about dorm life and told him how much they missed him, and every single call ended the same way, with Mr. Smith saying, "We love you, son. Keep going." The words stuck with him. Every long night at the library, every time he thought about giving up. "We love you. Keep going." And so he did. Years later, Daniel found himself walking into a hospital for the first time, not as a patient, but as a medical intern. He wore a white coat with his name stitched on the chest, Dr. Daniel Smith, Maryland. The moment he saw his reflection in the glass doors of the hospital, he had to pause. He stood there, staring at himself, his heart filled with disbelief. For a moment, he could see the little boy he had been, sitting alone in that cold children's home, wondering if he'd ever belong anywhere. He smiled. "Look at me now," he thought. But being a doctor wasn't just about wearing a white coat. It was hard work, long hours, constant pressure, and life-or-death decisions. Some days were harder than others, but Daniel had faced worse. One evening, during his shift in the emergency room, he encountered a young boy, no older than 8, brought in after a car accident. The boy's face was bruised, his eyes wide with fear. He clutched a small toy in his hand, a toy that looked a lot like the stuffed bear Daniel had once been given by his little sister. Daniel knelt beside the boy, his voice soft and calm. "Hey, buddy, you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you, okay?" The boy nodded, his small hands gripping the toy tighter. As Daniel checked the boy's injuries, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had come full circle. The boy's fear mirrored his own from all those years ago, but now he was the one offering comfort. 15 years after his adoption, the Smith family gathered for a celebration like no other. It wasn't a birthday or a graduation. It was a celebration of family, love, and everything they had been through together. The house was filled with the scent of home-cooked meals and the sounds of music and laughter. The kitchen table was piled high with food, and the dining room was decorated with photos of Daniel, pictures from his first day of school, his first basketball game, his high school graduation, and, of course, the photo of him in his doctor's coat. Daniel stood at the front of the room, his family gathered around him, smiling proudly. He took a moment to look at each of them, his mother, his father, his brothers, his sisters. He saw the people who had carried him through his darkest days. His eyes met Jake's, and Jake gave him a small nod, the same nod he'd given him after that cafeteria incident back in school. It was a nod of respect, pride, and love. Taking a deep breath, Daniel cleared his throat and spoke. 15 years, he began, his voice strong but filled with emotion. 15 years since I walked into this house for the first time. I was scared. I didn't think I belonged here. I didn't think I was good enough. But all of you made me believe that I was. You taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about love. It's about having people who will fight for you, even when you don't know how to fight for yourself. He paused, his eyes filling with tears. I wouldn't be here without you. I wouldn't be a doctor. I wouldn't be the man I am today. His voice cracked, and Mrs. Smith quickly wiped her eyes with a napkin. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I didn't deserve it. And because of that, I've spent every day trying to be the kind of person you can be proud of. His family clapped, tears in their eyes, but the room was filled with joy. Jake wrapped an arm around him, pulling him into a hug. "We've always been proud of you, little brother." Later that night, Daniel stood outside the house, gazing up at the stars. He thought about everything: the children's home, the first night he slept in his new bed, the bullying, the pain, and the love that followed. He smiled. He had come a long way. Inside the house, his family laughed and talked, their voices carrying through the open window. He could hear Mrs. Smith calling his name. "Daniel, come inside before it gets cold." He glanced at the stars one last time, feeling a quiet peace settle over him. "Coming, Mom," he called back, and this time he didn't hesitate. With a deep breath, he walked inside, knowing that no matter how far he went in life, he would always have a home waiting for him. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If it moved you, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories like this. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next one.